From how some people talk about Yiquan, particularly people from the global north, it's clear that they view it as a kind of possession. It's something that they've spent money to acquire, they've paid someone for it. In some cases they've outlaid large sums of money travelling to China, staying in China. They've paid for a certificate, a discipleship, sometimes costing thousands of pounds. And as a result, they own something. They own a possession. And I mean that in a different sense to, I remember my own coach saying that if you pay for it, you own it. I mean it in a different sense to that, because he also used to say that in China, the only thing that matters is, can you do it? And I remember him saying once, it wouldn't matter if it came to you in a dream. The only thing anyone cares about is, can you do it? And if you can do it, there's no arguing about it. When I say that people think they own each one, this is a different thing. This is thinking that you've bought into and paid for some kind of status, some kind of franchise. Not that you've paid for and received coaching and you can then go away and do what you want with it. This is about believing that you've bought the rights to something, that you own a possession. And it's also interlinked with the idea that each one is something like that, something that you can inherit. I'd say like a possession, but in most cases it's not even a thing, because it's not even from what we can see, it's not even a skill set. It's more about a kind of feudal status. So literally buying a title, so literally paying thousands of dollars for a certificate that gives you a title. And with that, the idea that you've bought into some kind of feudal lineage. And what goes along with that idea is the notion that each one itself is something like a possession, something like a fixed thing that you can obtain. And this is very different to how Wang Xiangzhai saw it. So I think most people, certainly outside of this framework of traditional Chinese philosophical thinking that Wang Xiangzhai is working within, don't get that each one's a social project. I think outside of China particularly, each one is presented almost exclusively as some kind of individual achievement. That is, as the acquisition of some predetermined level of supposedly transcendent skill. It's very hard to say what exactly that skill is supposed to be, because it's always kept very abstract and somehow beyond practical demonstration. And it's astonishing that so many people still buy that, but they really do, and they literally buy it, they literally buy into that. And that tells us something really quite profound about the nature of human suffering, but we'll come back to that later. So this individualized expression of each one, it's as if some sort of predetermined thing was there that you can just pay money for and you can have it. It's so far from how Wang Xiangzhai saw it. First of all, like pretty much every Chinese martial artist writing at the same time as him, Wang saw each one as a means of reinvigorating the health and culture of the Chinese population. That is not as some sort of super elite practice. There's no question that he saw highest level achievement in each one in its absolute deepest sense as being the very essence of Chinese wushu as a state of enlightenment, and that's a phrase that he uses, and something that was above and beyond even the higher road truth as he saw it of the so-called Neijie arts. But he certainly didn't view this as accessing a kind of set in stone secret skill passed down by the ancients, and we know this because he told us this. So even though he was running a business and even though people paid him to learn from him, he tried to get across a different understanding of what learning Chinese wushu is, or what exploring and unfolding your own ability through the medium of the science of Chinese wushu was. And he explicitly mocks people who think of, for example, finding an ancient formula inscribed on a turtle shell. And if you don't know, turtle shells were used in ancient China for purposes of divination. And he uses that as a metaphor for people who think that, or rather have been misled into thinking that what they're attempting to do in learning wushu is inherit something rather than unfold something, which is how Wang Xiangzhai saw it. Yiquan as a combination of traditional Chinese thinking and philosophy, but with science, and those two things together as a profound medium for unfolding your own ability. And according to his student Yang Demo, one of his most common sayings was that it's an absolute crying shame that people always look beyond themselves, thinking that the knowledge that wushu training is supposed to give you is somehow in someone else, rather than looking inside yourself and, as Wang Xiangzhai used to say, re-understanding yourself. Wang's student Yu Yongnian has also been very vocal about this, pointing out that Wang's vision wasn't of a style or a system or something that would be passed down through some kind of feudal lineage. And Yu also points out that Wang Xiangzhai despised and abolished the master-disciple system, and what he wanted to replace this with was a progressive science. And it's one of the ironies of science, although the way Wang Xiangzhai thinks about this comes originally from Buddhist thinking, but science is the same. It's one of the ironies that it's a social process that leads to individual education. And of course, each one's always about contradictions, and this is a biggie. I think that a lot of people, particularly outside of China or outside of traditional Chinese philosophy, inevitably interpret Wang Xiangzhai's thinking in their own way. Imagining something like a product that you can consume, and I mean literally as a consumer, buying it from a vendor like property, and then using this product to somehow elevate yourself as enlightened above others. I think that's a social perspective very alien to Wang's thinking. And think about that. Think about how teacher or master or shifu really just becomes, or just means, vendor or salesperson in that scenario, like they're selling you a new car. And how far that is from the reality of genuine, wholesome wushu transmission, where everyone is on the same path, just at different points, and everyone is mutually supporting one another in a social project of growth. I saw a paper disciple of a famous Chinese Yiquan teacher responding to someone on the internet, and the tone of his response was so appalling, demanding that he be shown respect and telling someone else that they should be grateful that he would even deem to lower himself to speak to a mere beginner. I think that way of behaving, that way of thinking, is so alien to how Wang Xiangzhai thought about wushu, and it's so alien to the idea of a wholesome, meaningful, mutually supportive path. It wasn't a surprise to me, I have to say, to then a couple of years later see that that person was selling Yiquan titles, instructor coaching titles, for a few €100 and literally 7 lessons and a payment, and you too could be someone that everyone else should grovel and scrape the earth to. What a living nightmare to exist like that, and what a way in the end to prostitute the integrity of yourself and the reputation of Yiquan and Wang Xiangzhai for petty personal gain. It's too easy for me to be vicious about things like that. I know that, and I know that it's something that I have to work on myself. A lot harder is to use something like this Buddhist idea of compassion. It doesn't mean that anyone has to be Buddhist to understand this point, but compassion is there to link people together under the idea that all of our fates are intertwined, so we can create, if you like, a positive social karma or a negative social karma through our behaviour. And through that, all of our possibilities of achieving higher level are intertwined, just as they are in science or any other field. We know that Buddhism was a profound influence on Wang Xiangzhai's thinking, and there's a concept that's particularly important. It's important in all of Buddhist thinking, but it's particularly important in Chinese Buddhist thinking, and it's the idea of dependent arising. So it's a complex philosophical concept, but we can think of it as implying that our everyday reality is something like a mutually informing system. Nothing has a specific truth or identity or value without being in some kind of relationship with everything else. And it's an idea that's very similar to, for example, George Hegel's dialectical philosophy in Western philosophical thinking. But there's something within Buddhist thinking that we can draw out here, and Wang Xiangzhai does draw this out, that's really useful in helping us understand Yiquan as a social field, as a social project. And it's the idea that enlightenment, or critically the opposite, we could say ignorance, but that's not the right word. We could just say, like that person who's selling the reputation of Yao Zongzun and Wang Xiangzhai for a few €100, that's not ignorance. And it's not just sin, if you want to use that word, a sin against the memory of those people and against Yiquan. It's to live a horrible existence. And if one person lives a horrible existence, then everyone else's existence is slightly more horrible. It creates this kind of negative social karma. So in Buddhist theory, it's possible to create chains of social practice that lead entire communities to becoming closer to an understanding of the nature of reality and therefore moving towards enlightenment, or alternatively to have negative patterns of social behaviour, of reasoning. Social structures themselves, from a sociological perspective, can have these negative trajectories. So, to be clear here, we're using this Buddhist idea, but it's not about Buddhism. It's about understanding how Wang Xiangzhai's thinking evolves from this Buddhist concept and how it's a useful way of understanding what Yiquan is. You can divorce it from any kind of religious or spiritual connotation in that sense. The academic idea holds on its own. So you can think, for example, about anything, science, boxing, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, anything that you can think of can also work like this. Once it's a social field where you've got people working together, sharing knowledge, and the idea, the goal, the ambition of improving generation upon generation, and that's critical. That's part of what we might call a kind of positive dharma. Dharma being the Buddhist idea of theory or understanding of practice. And it's a vitally important aspect of Dharma itself that you should want this generational improvement. Think about how many times Wang Xiangzhai talks about that, about how things that are wrong shouldn't pass forward into the next generation, about how each one needs to be built on by future generations, about how many each one teachers talk about research and development. And then just compare and contrast that with the people who say that let's just be honest, they say they've bought the pure system, like they've bought the franchise, they've bought the blueprints, and it's a fixed, pure, unchangeable thing, and that's it. It can't improve. And of course, those are the people who will then start teaching other things as well, because they run out of things to teach once they've taught the limited set of things that they were taught by their teacher. They never move on to that phase of independent research and development. And more importantly, they don't want to. They've already bought and paid for and got the deeds for the thing that they think is Yiquan. But let's think about the negative direction for a minute. The kind of negative dharma, if we want to use that term, that emerges when chains of bad reasoning or practice dominate a social field. In Buddhist theory, this begins with attachment, and this is Wang Xiangzhai's actual argument, which he says directly he's drawing from Buddhist philosophy. But we don't need to be Buddhist to understand this, but we do need it to understand Wang Xiangzhai's thinking and to see this deeper level of how he perceives each one as a scientific field. I know that sounds kind of ironic when we're talking about Buddhism, but Wang Xiangzhai is all about contradiction and contradictory thinking, and the fusion between traditional Chinese thinking and science is key to that contradictory element in his arguments. And what he says is that there are only two approaches in martial arts. The first is to follow an attachment, the second is to let go of all attachments, in which case there is literally nothing left except understanding the nature of the reality that you exist within. Or rather, that's the overall Buddhist concept. Wang says understanding the reality of martial arts is the only thing left. And obviously he means by that he's limiting his analysis to the martial arts field. And he says that only if you follow the second path can you eventually succeed as a martial artist in the deepest sense. Now, usually this isn't a choice. You start out attached, everyone does, for example, to mysticism and magic, or fantasies, or for people who aren't from an Asian background, to some kind of Orientalism. But most commonly we start out with an attachment to an identity or a need for some kind of identity that lifts us out of our normal everyday identity that for whatever reason we're not happy with. And then, boom, something happens and you can no longer afford to hold on to that attachment. Usually it's something traumatic, something that absolutely smashes all of your prior expectations and disappoints them. And it can leave people very much in a kind of lull of pointlessness when all the expectations you had, for example, of your teacher, of your school, of your own path in martial arts get broken. That wasn't what happened to me, I should hasten to add. It really was a very individual thing, and understanding about who I am that led to this point in me. And what that was kind of understanding my essential depth of being alone, and aloneness drew me towards things that I could wear like personality jewellery to make people want to be around me. And for that reason I was attracted to things in martial arts that, well, martial arts itself is the classic example of the thing that people think other people will want to be involved with, will want to be around. And within Chinese martial arts you move your way up through the things that are supposedly the most special that you can collect as personality jewellery. Start with Shaolin, move on to Tai Chi, and suppose eventually Yiquan, something like that. And there was a lull, an incredibly deep lull of pointlessness when I kind of had a mini enlightenment about why I was training, and I just gave up. I just gave up for 18 months, and the only reason I came back to training was I lost a very serious fight, me versus, I don't even know how many, but 3 or 4 at least, and I was left for dead. And although a highly traumatic thing at the time, I knew I had to come back to training just for the sake of keeping fit. But when I took that beating, not that I'm excusing what happened by any means, but it did, in a really curious way, release me of all the attachments, most of the attachments to bullshit. Some attachments I'm fond of, and I don't think that's such a terrible thing on a wholesome, holistic path. But for the most part, I was released, and I could just see, well, if I don't want to be lay on the floor just waiting to die, which I was, I have to pursue what's real. And somehow my abiding love for Chinese wushu was still very strong. That spark was still there, so I set to pursuing it, understanding what my teacher had told me on a deeper level, to which only you can do. Only you can unfold that. Your teacher can't pass it on like property, so something has to happen. But it would be a lot easier if people could just try and make that decision voluntarily rather than being left for dead. In any case, what does Wang Xiangzhai mean by attachments in this sense? So let's say that for whatever reason you're deeply attached to the idea of status and belonging. So what becomes of paramount importance to you is rank and so-called lineage. And I think most people in Chinese martial arts have been there. And for those people who've been through that and maybe come out the other side, you recognise that that deviates you well off the path of pursuing what is real. You might make some progress, but ultimately, if deep down, and particularly if you don't acknowledge this directly to yourself, it completely perverts and deviates you away from real achievement. And why do we do it? Well, it seems like a good deal at the time. The price of being below some, you can be above some others. And as you make your way up through the hierarchy of a school or a system, the number of people above you dwindles and the number of people below you grows. Just seems to fulfill some kind of psychological need. And as time goes on, you're completely deviated from the reality of training. You get so much invested in that status and position. Wang Xiangzhai's student Yu Yongnian talks about this and how this process occurs, and how particularly in Yiquan so many people ended up, okay, they have status and they have respect and they have titles, but the price is appalling. They have to parasitize the reputation of others to boost and maintain their own. And that makes your so-called status into something vile. And this is what Yu Yongnian says. It becomes a living nightmare. And the next thing you know, you need it to put on posters and flyers and social media to draw in customers and make money. It's a pocket hell that people make for themselves, and it violates the entire point of each one, transforming it from a medium of shared development into some kind of feudal pyramid scheme. Wang Xiangzhai used to say that the thing people get wrong the most in each one is in looking for someone else to teach you your own native ability. I can't think of a better example of how that idea gets perverted than this feudalism that infects people's... Well, enough of that. Even in its most positive form, a school or coaching system really should just be a scaffold to lend you discipline and moral support, while you and also your coaches should be continuing on their training, all work together towards the realisation of what is real and how far all of you can understand and express that, and lay the groundwork for the next generation of people to go even further. So if you can't let go of your attachment to the idea and trappings of belonging, then you can never achieve that. It's just one of the contradictions of a social project that's nevertheless there to bring out the best in you. And it's also one of the contradictions of what makes a meaningful and genuinely wholesome coaching relationship. It isn't that. True lineage isn't some kind of feudal family tree. True lineage is about sharing the path together, about going through thick and thin and exploring your potential in a wholesome and meaningful way. Direct personal relationships, not based on a hierarchy, but based on everyone being on the path together. Even if you're at different points on the path, everyone's on the path together. And that's so even if you're attached to a specific goal like sports fighting or self-defense, you'll be deviated. That is, if you can't ultimately let go and see these as disposable vehicles of progression, not as destinations in themselves. Wang specifically argues this when he says, practice the method for 10 years, then abandon the method. And think about that. All of those endless arguments about street versus ring or sparring versus challenge fights. Think about how Wang's perspective is so profoundly beyond all of that. It's like a physicist talking to a mouse. So, negative dharma, if we want to use that phrase, first emerges in these individual attachments. I wouldn't personally reduce it so simplistically to the psychology of individuals, and to be fair, Buddhist theory doesn't do that either. It's a logical implication of the doctrine of dependence arising that individual desire, or I would say alienation, is a social product, not some individual essence. We're all linked together in that misery. So think about that poor soul in his pocket hell, selling Yiquan instructor certificates for a few $100s, selling out whatever value Yao Zhongzhen's name still has in the Chinese martial arts community, just to put a little bit extra in his bank account. Well, we're all part of that vicious social world that forced that person into that position where they needed money that desperately. And as we're all part of the Yiquan community, then we're all affected by that negative dharma. In any case, however we perceive it first, whether it be as some kind of psychology of people or whether it be some kind of socially arising sense of alienation, it nevertheless presents itself in some very predictable ways. The first and most common thing that people do is to transform their attachments into apparent positives. So a crippling sense of insecurity or inferiority becomes an attachment to the illusion of status. And so something like Lineage or your teacher, the school that you belong to, the so-called branch of Wushu, the most meaningless and negative of all aspects in Chinese Wushu, in Wang Xiangzhai's view, becomes transformed into the paramount Yiquan virtue. Attachment to a teacher then leads people to pervert obvious reality in some cases, so fake or unbelievable demonstrations are defended in ways that prostitute the integrity of the defender. Low level is celebrated as a great achievement, and a failure to engage in realistic training becomes higher level practice, and so on. And once again, integrity is prostituted, as those that do engage in realistic training are dismissed as being on the wrong path. All of this is a form of self-delusion peculiar to Chinese martial arts, and it's the very opposite of the path of the real. There are lots of other examples, but those two are paramount, and more importantly, they are highlighted by Wang Xiangzhai himself. But to see these as the actions of horrible people isn't all that helpful. Those horrible people are still people living, as Yu Yongnian says, in a horrible nightmare. Helping those people helps everyone, because what they do poisons the whole Yiquan project. It's not just an individual thing. It dominates and corrupts an entire social scene, dragging it into a chain of negative dharma, or negative theory if we like. Emphasising the Buddhist basis of Wang's thinking for the sake of academic clarity, we don't need to think of it in Buddhist terms per se. I don't, for the most part. If science was run like modern Yiquan community, then it would disintegrate and become broadly irrelevant, just like Yiquan has. We don't need any kind of religious understanding to recognise that. The final point to note then is that there can also be positive chains of social growth. So even one person who has real achievement isn't enough to promote wider growth. Even if people become attached to that person, engage as negative devotees, attacking anyone who criticises them, then you don't help the enlightenment of the people. The vile stuff that's so often spewed onto people in the name of Wang Xiangzhai or his students or Yiquan more generally, that doesn't support the growth of positive chains of understanding. It creates more negative chains that lead people away from enlightenment, if you want to use that phrase. Wang Xiangzhai said that the sea belongs to everyone who wants to use it. Each one is everyone's, and it has no lineages, no systems, no schools, no masters, and no disciples. Be honest for a minute. If you knew for absolute certainty that what I'm saying there is true, would you still be interested in each one?